Hey everyone, welcome to Dungeon Class. I'm Gonzo, this is Mark, and today we're going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly with dungeons in your campaign.
Today we're talking about dungeons, and we'd like to hear how you use dungeons in the comments below. And while you're commenting, make sure you subscribe and click the notifications bell.
Yeah, we'd appreciate it.
That would be great.
So, we're talking about dungeons, and obviously the name of the game is Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons have been a part of the game from the beginning, if not created for this thing. We know that Gary Gygax, his initial creation was that, hey, you're the dungeon master. You create a dungeon,
Right.
you create the rooms, you decide what's in them, and your players have to go through that.
Yeah.
So it was kind of the first iteration of kind of like an old school video game or something. So, and the goal was to go through, the word dungeon crawl comes from this scenario, but to go through, to explore this labyrinth of rooms and caves and whatever,
Right.
to battle monsters, destroy them,
Oh, heck
and
yeah.
then obtain the treasure
Oh, absolutely.
and walk out and level up.
Yeah, level up. That's it. Boom.
So that is how it used to be,
Right.
and we found that that's probably the ugly part of a dungeon in your game.
Yeah. Yeah. Anymore, we expect more out of our games than that. That's pretty generic.
Yeah. Yeah, it is generic. There's no background ties. There's no, maybe the story hook is pretty weak. You
Right.
know, like there's something in there you need or that kind of thing, and that's kind of like all the reason your players are going through it.
Yeah.
And
Fat loot in a dungeon just doesn't motivate people like it used to.
not anymore. No, we're story driven,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I know that word sometimes gets thrown around a little too much. People
Right.
complain somewhat about, well, story isn't everything, and they're right. But we know how to do the battle mechanics. We know how to detect for traps. We know how to do all these things, find secret doors, and so we're looking for more.
Sure.
There's no political machinations. There's no sense of urgency. It's just room after room. If you need a short rest, you take a rest in this old dungeon.
Yeah.
And also, maybe they were vanilla dungeons. Maybe they were
Yeah.
brick and mortar, dwarven mine kind of style, what we
Right.
all picture when we think of a dungeon.
Sure.
A crypt of some kind.
Right.
And we know that we've gotten away from that a lot too. And a lot of things can actually become a dungeon. So,
Right.
which we can talk about. So that's some of the ugly,
Okay.
where dungeons actually become the game.
Okay.
And we're advising against that.
Right. It's not just called dungeon.
Yeah, that's a different game.
Yeah.
So the bad is that the dungeons have improved. Maybe the monsters make more sense. Maybe
Yeah.
there's a little more rhyme and reason to the rooms and how they're developed. Maybe the story hook is a little bit better and your players are a little more engaged in what's going on. But maybe they're too long.
Yeah.
Tomb of Horrors is a great example
Oh.
of that for us.
Way too
It's
long.
a very long, grueling dungeon.
Right.
And if you try to break that up over sessions, it feels maybe even longer because depending on how often you're able to play, if it's
Yeah.
weekly or however, you could be in a dungeon for weeks.
Yeah, that was a big dungeon. And Dungeon of the Mad Mage, I know that's another big one, really big.
It's a big one.
Yeah,
We
mega
haven't
dungeon,
played it,
yeah.
but I understand that it's pretty interesting. But it was built to basically to reminisce about the old school way of Dungeons
Yeah.
and Dragons. So it's pretty interesting. Also, some of the bad things that you would want to avoid is that your traps are still fairly vanilla. They don't have a lot of creativity to them. They're pit traps, they're rocks falling, there's spikes coming from the wall. Everything we've all seen in the opening scene of Indiana Jones,
Right.
we use in our traps. And those are always effective, but the more creative you become, the better the traps would be for
Right.
everybody.
Right.
It's still, maybe you missed some story elements. Maybe there was something in a room that there's an ancient jewel in that room that the players didn't go to. They heard something at the door and they're like, we're not going in there, we're just going to keep going.
Yeah, forget
And
that.
your players forgot it, and so you've a very important plot element. Maybe they needed that jewel to defeat the big bad at the end, is missing from the story. And as a dungeon master, it can be easy to forget
Yeah.
that, shoot, they needed that.
Yeah.
And now they're here at the big bad and they don't have that one thing I was
Yeah.
expecting they would find.
Right.
Now you can drop it to them at some point, but sometimes when we design these dungeons as dungeon masters, we put things in things that we think that they're going to find easily, whether it's a note or something or a clue.
Right.
And you never know what your players are going to do or how they're going to skip through or
Absolutely not.
pass wall or whatever spell they cast to,
Right.
So you never know. Also, one of the bad things would be that the plot's not advancing. You're still opening doors. You're still defeating monsters. You're still getting treasure. But nothing in the plot, whether personally for your characters or for the overarching plot, is really advancing. And if you have a whole session where all they did was clear rooms, that can feel like an old video game or something.
Yeah, like Doom back in the day, that was the thing. You just go in to clear the, or even Diablo to an extent nowadays is clearing rooms. And I think in games like Fallout, which you expect to come into a room and see that there was a reason why the things are laying there. Okay, that makes sense. This room's got a bunch of debris in it, and the debris is basically it's consistent with an old telegraph office or an old TV station. You go, oh, that's the kind of things you'd find in a TV station. So there was some thought put into that, and it doesn't necessarily just clear a bunch of monsters out in there. So yeah, we definitely have progressed in video games, and we should progress in our dungeons as well.
I agree. And that leads to the good. We have learned that over time that creating dungeons can be a lot of fun, can be memorable, and can really lead to quite a bit of engagement with your players. One of the keys is making your dungeon smaller. If you don't need a big labyrinth of mazes and traps and riddles and all of that, if you don't need all that, don't put it in. 3 to 5 rooms, with the goal being at the end. Or maybe at the beginning and he runs to the end and they're chasing people or whatever. But just a smaller one night kind of dungeon is great. And that's how I have generally done those in my campaigns, is that it's become a big part of our adventures, where they go through a crypt or whatever it may be. But it's not all of the adventure. It's not the whole thing. Right. Speaking of crypts or caves or Underdark, anything can basically become a dungeon.
Sure. Because
dungeons are kind of walled, it can feel railroady. The good part is you can use anything: an undersea cave, an old dwarven mine that has been repurposed by a bunch of goblins and whatever's leading those goblins, right? It could be anything, and that's what's neat. Is a dungeon isn't just underneath of a castle, whatever. Curse of Strahd's a great example. You go through all these plot elements of gathering items to help defeat Strahd and help your battle against him, and eventually you have to enter his lair, and that's the dungeon part of that adventure. But it was used in a way where it was just part of the adventure, and it made sense why you would go in there. You're trying to get Strahd, so it was pretty neat. Another one of the good things that you could do is making your traps a little more realistic, or have a way for your players to see why those would be there. It makes no sense at all that the Knoll Chieftain, who's taken over this dungeon of whatnot, can travel up and down this hallway, yet any step you take is going to set off this pitfall. That doesn't make any sense, but it would make sense if your players have an opportunity to do a perception check and they can notice that there's certain steps that the dust is worn off, and those aren't going to be the pressure plates that set off the trap, or a tripwire that's someone who knows about the trap can easily step over. Another thing we thought about is maybe all the traps that they've encountered have been on the ground floor, on the ground level, very much pressure plate, tripwires, those kind of things. Well, how does this hallway lead to anywhere without anybody tipping this off? Well, maybe it doesn't walk. Maybe it's a beholder which floats, or something else.
Flayer,
or a mind flayer or something. So something that doesn't have feet. So hence all the traps that are designed in there are for anyone that's not like that. So use your head, be creative. That's the part where you get to have as much fun as you can as a dungeon master, and as a player, it's really fun to encounter things or wake up to something like, oh, that's why this was here.
That's good.
So, and then one other thing is also the treasure, which we all look forward to, and especially at the end. Try to make the treasure part be unique. Try to make the treasure be something that's important to the players. Maybe it's part of the plot hook. Maybe that was the whole idea of going in, was to gather this ancient chalice which can heal people or something. whatever it may be, it shouldn't just be a +1 sword and here's a shield and there's a bunch of gold.
Yeah.
That goes back into the bad portion of a dungeon.
Yeah, it needs to be meaningful. Something that they were looking for. Some quest item they were looking for. They're going to find that. It's all part of that horde. Yeah. Anything else is like kind of generic, and that's old school.
Yeah.
And you expect to find something really, especially if it was an epic battle. They beat a pretty significant person. To just get a bunch of coins.
Yeah.
Oh, gee, that's
Have
exciting.
fun with it. I mean, there's nothing better than they pick up a sword and the sword whispers, "I am yours to command," or something sentient, or something that's more than just a normal magical item.
I've always wanted to find the singing sword from Bugs Bunny, but that's just me. Yeah.
Well, you can make it happen.
I can make it happen.
You're the dungeon master.
I can do anything.
All right, and then maybe the last thing, and maybe the most important thing, is if you can create a reason or something that hooks the players and one of their personal backgrounds to something in that dungeon, whether it's the person they're fighting, it's the item that they're finding, the person they're rescuing, whatever it may be. If you can tie that in to the background of one of your players, it is a memorable occasion for them.
Yeah,
and regardless of how many rooms they had to go through, and regardless of the loss that they faced when they went through. Maybe there's some loss there in dungeons.
Yeah.
But if they accomplish something, and in their minds their stories has progressed, the plot story has progressed, they're going to feel like this was just a grand adventure.
Right.
And it won't feel like a dungeon crawl.
Yeah.
So
Don't want that.
we will do some other videos to help you and I to learn how to make better and more creative dungeons. And we'll do those later. With that, class dismissed.